as I outlined in part one, which I'll link up here, of the PEA saga, which was the PEA versus WESA, since that's essentially what the whole battle over whether PEA players and teams would compete in the North American division of EPL essentially boils down to. In that fact, that's why it was PEA who was negotiating with WESA themselves. Now, the other chapter, which obviously was the original mechanism which people saw of this whole drama, which is actually the PEA versus their own players of PEA teams. This is obviously going to be part two. So, the notion in terms of PEA versus players was the player-driven component that PEA themselves had put out to the public, which is when they announced the team, they stressed this fact that it was going to be a league about players as well. Now, by the way, WESA did the same thing themselves, but PEA went even further. So, for example, Jason Katz, PEA commissioner, in the announcement when they opened PEA, said the PEA represents something new in esports, an association of top teams running their own league and sharing the profits and the decision making with the players. Then Steve Arneset, aka Liquid 112, co-CEO of Team Liquid, said publisher leagues and team third-party tournament organizers aren't sharing profits with the players and teams. This is hindering the potential for esports to rival other professional sports leagues where players and teams are all aligned to put on the best show year after year. So part of the problem there is that even though PEA is actually in theory more for players and has better player revenue sharing than WESA, by also presenting themselves publicly in this manner, that players are really important to them and have some authoritative voice, etc. When it then turns out players don't and players can't actually affect change, they've laid out the opportunity for themselves to get wrecked using their own words, which is what has happened in this particular scenario. PEA's own PR, own public relations, is what has got them wrecked here, their own press releases. So you can't just tell your players that it's in their contract that they have to play wherever you want to, or that the board has voted to do something they don't want to do. If you've already told them that you're going to have this great say and that the league's all about the players and sharing power with the players, I mean, they're going to see, well, we don't have any power. We don't get any say in this particular sense. I mean, funnily enough, this was the issue that I outlined in the WESA video that I made of the big difference between being heard and having an actual say or decision making in what happens to you in the future. There's a big difference there. So not only was that a PR disaster in terms of how it's then come back to bite them, but what a PR nightmare unfolded when it came to how the PEA owners have dealt with the issue when the players brought it up via their letter. Their reaction to that has been way worse than the implications of the letter itself. If PEA had just shut the fuck up, waited, let the players go ham, let the players say all this shit they want, people make videos, and then PEA had just come out with what essentially was Noah Winston's response to Scott's letter, Sir Scoot's letter, the PEA players' representative letter, it would have been a much better scenario and they would have looked a lot better. Instead, we had this scenario where owners were scrambling to get players on record saying they didn't read or didn't agree with the sentiment of the letter, as though that wouldn't get out. Do you know how DK and people like that operate? Where they get sources are? Their sources are other teams. Their sources are other orgs. Their sources are players within your teams who just don't want to go on record but want the information out there, again, in a public power play when it can benefit them. So that information immediately got out, and now people just heard that the owners are trying to get the players on record doing that. So first of all, it counteracts the very thing that you're trying to do in itself. And then secondly, when it then comes out, as has happened, that players come out and say, well, actually, I did agree with all that, and it's not that I was tricked into doing it. Now you can't even go ahead and say those things yourself. It doesn't even work that way. So we had Reginald, the owner of TSM, come out saying that Sean Gares had manipulated players into agreeing to that and being a part of this. We had Jack come out and say that comment about Sir Scoots, where he said this is someone who would always, let me think, what was the actual quote? I'll find it for you, because the actual quote's worth seeing. The quote was, let's see, the letter was written by someone who has always gone out of his way to make teams look bad. So we have Jack saying that about Sir Scoots, who is the player rep in this particular scenario, attacking his character and his credentials, essentially. Now, you have to understand, Sir Scoots was directly and in a head way involved with evil geniuses in the years when teams, like Cloud9 didn't exist at the time, but when those sorts of NA teams that now make up the NALCS teams that largely make up the power base of PEA were just coming around. When League of Legends was starting to get big, Evil Geniuses were the top dogs within their region in NA. And Scoots is very experienced with those issues within those teams as well. So you have to understand, back in those days, Evil Geniuses really did dominate NA. They really did run it like gangsters almost and just wreck everyone, take all the sponsors, leave very little for other people like these people. So these people naturally don't really particularly like some of the Evil Geniuses people, are kind of against them in some particular sense, because people like Scoots and people like Evil Geniuses basically told them to fuck off and took the lunchbox back in the day. So unsurprisingly, they feel like that's not the person they want representing them. They're players against them in this scenario. And since they're so bought into this notion that they themselves believe, like they've said in the past, like, well, my team's all about the players, and the players are so important to me. They're like sons to me, and we're friends, and we all talk and we get along. It's so important. They don't just present themselves as employers. So unfortunately, they can't even believe in their own minds that their players would act against them in this way. So it has to be that someone's manipulating. It's either Sean Gares, if you're Reginald, or it's so Scoots has somehow tricked them all into getting on his side and lied to them, etc. Or beyond that, it's WESA. I mean, actually, WESA, if you look at it, seems like the most likely candidate ultimately. It's WESA who's somehow involved in it. And that's why they're having this backlash against the players directly in this individual sense, ratting the who's done this. Let's smoke out the actual ringleaders of this thing. There's also the fact that because PEA pushed the whole aspect that you'd make profit, they're seeing that as something which should be a primary aspect as to why their players shouldn't be against it. Now, it sounds to me like they did a very poor job of outlining the profit aspect, the revenue sharing, how it would work out, and how it would benefit players more to be in a PEA league than EPL NA. They did a bad job outlining that to their players. I mean, I have to say, from my following of esports and understanding of the industry over the last 15, 16 years, players will follow money. Like players who are now presenting themselves, it's all about their choice and they want to compete for the fans. They can say what they want there, but that's the player equivalent of the team saying, oh, I'm just all about the players in my team. And then the org or the PEA association being like, we're about giving players a say and all that. Like that's all the stuff that sounds good, but what is your real motivation? What is the real thing that pushes you forwards? What is your real defining factor that you will make your decisions based on? What is the deciding factor for you? And players will follow money. That's why players don't have a union right now. That's why players don't give a fuck. So I actually think it's been pretty disingenuous by the players involved in this and in some sense outright obtuse on their part that they have not given good reasons as to why they want to compete in EPL. They haven't really outlined why EPL is better than PEA, why they would want to over it. They've outlined that they want the choice and that they feel like the choice is being taken away from them, and that's what's worrying them. But the public has taken it as like we'd rather compete in EPL or you should compete in both somehow. It's a very weird scenario in that sense. Like if the players really wanted to communicate this to the public, I feel like they could have done it much better. Like why would they need to make what would these owners in PEA need to make PEA a better alternative to EPL? Is EPL just the be-all and end-all? Does EPL have to exist because it existed in the past? How about explaining what your owners could do to make PEA a better alternative, and therefore you would do PEA over EPL? At the moment, it's not about that. It's just about droning back on and going back to this, no, but I must be the one who decides. Yeah, but what about how I can make the decision better? No, but I must be the one that says, okay, we get it, mate, but as the PEA owners explain to them, ultimately, you get a say in it, but you don't decide. You're under contract, and this is the way the leagues run, etc. We decide these sorts of things, and you signed those contracts. You signed away the ability to make such choices. So the PEA also made a huge mistake in pushing the aspect that they were going to have the highest level of transparency in the industry. I mean, that's another mistake because provably it's not been the case. I mean, they've actually have been wrecked repeatedly by these leaks and by things coming out privately and by players saying they weren't involved and weren't informed of things that were going on behind the scenes, even if that turns out to be miscommunication. Like actually PEA didn't plan to just leave forever and to force EPL to, even if that turned out not to be the case. It's a massive problem you must acknowledge if you're PEA, that if the very people you are trying to communicate with and in a transparent manner and to keep in on all the decisions and have some say in the decisions, don't think that they are being communicated with or in a transparent manner or having a say in decisions, you have in itself inherently and quite clearly failed in said communication. It's not enough to say it's a miscommunication. You have failed. It's your miscommunication. It's not necessarily theirs. And you can say, oh, but they didn't ask questions. They didn't come to us again. That's the part where it breaks down from PEA. It doesn't work in that sense. No, the transparency is you keep them informed in it. You tell them, listen, I'm going to talk to WESA right now and I'm going to make this sort of a case. But I just want to keep you informed before I do, so you don't worry that maybe this is like the final thing and I'm issuing an ultimatum, and if WESA says no, then they're out of the deal. That way, when WESA then comes to the players and say, oh, it's the end, it's the apocalypse, they gave us an ultimatum, it and we can't take it. Therefore, you're not going to be in EPL. It's all over for you. Your players trying to control you. They didn't do anything they promised. The players have got, no, actually, I was told by my owner, like, this is just like, they're negotiating. Can you please, like, continue to talk to them? Like, we go by whatever our team's doing, whatever PA decides. And, I'd rather you negotiate with them than talk to me. That's what might happen at that point in time. And we saw that the transparency and communication was not there between PA and the players, because when Hayes came out and said that, like, Hotshot had been a good owner, etc., Reginald tried to sort of spin that as though, like, oh, look, he talked to his players, but then Hayes had to come out himself and say, actually, that's not the case. In fact, no one communicated with us either. This is also, I don't want to be manipulated in that way, because obviously Hayes had signed the letter himself. So the players, PEA have wrecked themselves with the PR for the players as well. And then obviously the whole thing where it appeared as though Reginald had fired Sean Gares over the letter and manipulating the players, etc. That's a mega bad PR move, especially the timing of when it hit. I mean, holy moly, that's just like the worst way you could do it. Because now you've also taken someone who's a very controversial figure within PEA, made him a front man for the piece, etc. in that moment, because it's all about Sean Gares being the head guy for the players, and now you've made it him versus him, and now it looks like you've been super unfair and super capricious in terms of how you wreck this guy, and now it's all going to be about you and that person and character assassination in that sense. It's not going to even be about a united PEA front and the owners. I mean, this is a ridiculous scenario, and that's why there'll be another part of this video where it'll be all about Sean Gares versus Reginald and that whole thing, because that's its own kettle of fish, that's its own can of worms, and a nightmare for everyone involved, really. So then we've got to look at the fact that if we summarize the PEA versus the players and the issue there. Now, the problem is not the actuality of the situation, because the actuality of the situation, as I explained in part 1, is actually better for players in PEA versus PEA and versus overall leagues than it is for players who are part of teams that are in WESA versus WESA and overall leagues. There's actually an imbalance. PEA is better off as far as I can tell, except that they'll probably have a less competitive league. The real issue, as was the main issue in the WESA issue, was how WESA presented themselves, what they said they were all about, how they would run things, and then the gap between the perception they tried to create and then the actual reality of the situation. Likewise, PEA's problem is they tried to present this perception that power would be in some way in the hands of the players when it isn't. That decision-making would be in the hands of the players when, at least before this big issue came up and the owners now decided they would give the players the decision, it wasn't. And they even said it's contractually, it's us who decide. And also that the players would be constantly informed, and there'd be this transparency where they'd always be informed of what was going on and given the reasons why in the backstory, so that they then couldn't be in a situation where they had a lack of information, which is what WESA, which is what ESL's been able to exploit to gain their advantage overall in this situation. So that's one of the big problem, because it allows people like WESA, who also don't put power into their players' hands, to actually win out against PEA, who in theory, at least on the basis of their charter and what they've said, are giving more power to the players and more revenue sharing and more opportunity to benefit from the league than WESA is. Somehow the ones that are doing less have won out the PR battle. They've pulled off the chess move, this gambit, using the players of PEA against PEA themselves, that at the moment has them, PEA, coming back to the negotiating table in a weakened position, even though PEA in theory, if things had gone the way they thought, had the players, had most of the league, had the position and the prize money to say, you've got to negotiate with us on our terms, and we'll be the ones who accept a reasonable offer from you. Now it's the other way around. Now it's starting to even out again, even though WESA's offering less in all regards and has less to offer in pretty much every single sense, even in terms of how they treat players and the whole player rights issue. If there's the players' rights issue, why is WESA so good? I don't really understand that part still for PEA players. They're not even involved in WESA. So you've got to consider this. The players still have not even said that they don't want to play in PEA, and explicitly that they want no part of PEA. They just wanted the choice as to whether they play in PEA. That's the key aspect. And then also whether they play in EPL. Now, this aspect has not been outlined well enough, because PEA is so bad, then why is it the case that at the moment the intimation is we'd rather compete in EPL over everything else, but would you rather compete in EPL and PEA? If so, that hasn't been well outlined. Would you rather compete in PEA only if it had certain things better than EPL? Hasn't been outlined very well. So one of the problems I have with this is I feel like part of the reason it hasn't been outlined well by the players is because the players themselves are using us, the public, as a chess move in the game against their owners. Now, WESA used the players as a chess move against the PEA owners. The players are using us as chess pieces against the PEA owners to get what they want and to get them back to the negotiating table and to get them to give up more and to get it to be more favourable for the players. You have to acknowledge this if you look at how it's being done, because whenever people omit information or only present the information that benefits them, it's because they want you to take a certain perception from it. So the fact that we don't have this extra information here, these extra specific aspects, mean that it isn't really the way that players seem to be presented. It's not just about their choice essentially. You've also got to consider, if the players really cared about this, they could have solved this months ago. They could have solved this at the beginning of 2016, and this couldn't be possible. You know why? They could have made a union. If they wanted this sort of bargaining power and a direct say over what revenue share they get, which leagues they compete in, how they compete, what the transparency is, then the way they could have done that is a player union. Same as PEA, teams have banded together. Same as WESA and organ teams have banded together. They could be players banded together. And then the players could directly negotiate with the bigger body. And instead of separate players coming out and separate players writing a letter and having to have someone rep them, that could all exist within a union. And that would take place. And before the teams were allowed to negotiate which league they did or didn't play in, they'd have to have a union rep involved and they'd have to keep him updated on all of it. They could have done all this. Now, why doesn't the union exist? Because the union requires on some basic level that all these players, whether regionally or in the international scene, be united. Now, that was tried. It was failed. Rich Lewis was trying to set one up. Players claimed they were trying to set one up, but really they weren't. They were just affinity groups. They were their own little player associations, if anything. And this was due to their own stupidity, their own greed, people at the top end of the player base not wanting to give things up or having priorities that were stupid priorities, like I want first-class flights everywhere and an even better hotel, when the real issue should have been setting the baseline for these sorts of things. Players' right to choose, or how we all, collectively, where we compete and in what conditions and how. If they'd done all of that, that would be the case. But you know why that didn't happen? Because as I tried to outline in the past, players are greedy as well. You know how orgs are greedy? You know how devs are greedy and want all the control and to decide things like Riot, Blizzard? Yeah, well then you know when the power comes down to the level of organisers, like tournament organisers, ESL, DreamHack, they're greedy. They want to have control over more. They want most of the profit to come to them. They want their needs tailored to and them to be the priority. Well, you know what? Once you go below organisers of events, you got teams. Guess what? Teams can be greedy too. They want to benefit as much as they can. They want as much control as they can. They want people below them to do what they want to go. Well, you know what? You go down the hierarchy, just because you're at the bottom. This is what we found with bloody fucking socialism and communism in Europe, didn't we? When you give power to all the people at the bottom, guess what? They have abuses as well. Give them power. They can abuse their power. They can make themselves the priority over everyone else. They don't just give everyone an equal share of everything. They can do it so that they get to control what's happening overall here. And so what happened was, within the player group, we had abuses. And that's why a union could not exist and did not exist. The top people in the player base, the ones that are the most well-off, the most successful, the most power, didn't give a fuck about the players at the bottom end of the scene. And they didn't really particularly care to represent that guy's rights. Yet, when they look up the hierarchy, go, why hasn't this team represent my rights when they don't have to? And then the teams are like, but why is this organizer just trying to run all his leagues without giving me some of the money for no reason, even though I haven't exerted any power and unionised? And then the organizer looking up the dev going, what the fuck? I was trying to run tournaments in league. Why can't I just share in all the profits and have control? Why are you taking all the control that you legally have? Like, it's ridiculous the way people in this hierarchy are all blind to abuse, except when it's above them in the hierarchy. Within their own group, nope, this all seems fine. It's like some shit on Westworld. Nope, doesn't seem like there's anything here. It seems all fine to me. Like, what the fuck's going on here? And then people who are fans just sit there, and then they're the plebs, like the fucking players. They're like, yeah, it's bullshit, isn't it? It's all unfair. You got to look at the different levels. People are entitled to certain things at different levels. And yes, it'd be nice if they share, but you got to ask what compels them to share. What is the mechanism that would make them? It's leverage from people below. When the player base won't play for the teams, now you got a leverage issue. Or when the player base leverage the fans against the teams and their sponsors, now you got an issue. Now the teams have to in some way resolve that. Now, Reginald resolved it by, in theory, indirectly because of that, firing Sean Gares. That's one way to resolve it, and then trying to round everyone up and get them all on his side again. What about when the teams leverage all their teams and say, we won't play in your league, or we want to renegotiate the league? Now the org has to share some of that power, do that in that particular sense. What happens when the orgs go to a dev and do this? Now, this has never actually happened. Devs have either taken complete control, as we've seen in other games, Blizzard, Riot Games, or they just do nothing like Valve, and they're kind of like a laissez-faire approach. They're just an absent parent. We never actually had the orgs have to go to the player, the dev itself, and break it up, because at the moment, if the dev gets involved, they tend to become the org. So that's never actually happened. Essentially, if you want to know what's going on in this particular sense, go and Google something called the Magna Carta, where it was about these rich noblemen wanting some of the power of the king, and the king not to be this divine leader who had total power over them entirely. They wanted some of the power. Now, When they got some of the power, that's like the basis of a lot of Western civilization, right? And how society's formed. No. It's the basis. It's not all the rest of it, though. Because then guess what had to happen? Then we had all these lords and robber barons and all these fucks. Then you had to get some power from them. And you had to get it so it wasn't just rich people and aristocrats to say everything. You had to get some more power down below it. Now, you can certainly argue how far the power went beyond that. Didn't go that much further if you looked at kind of the stalemate of, Americans come along and then, a lot of those ideas went out the window. And now it's the federal government doing everything again. But you can see that the power structure gradually bestows power when the people below, who yes can run it and are the key lifeblood of it, enforce their power by unionizing and leveraging their position against the ones above them to get some more for themselves. They'll never be in complete control and the ones who benefit the most, but they'll get something for it. That's something to understand about this, and the fact that players themselves are not innocent in this area, and their own greed has led them to this position where they're now in position to get fucked over by the WESAs and PEAs of this world. And when I say fucked over, I just mean their position fucked over. It's not necessarily that PEA and WESA are some evil entities that are fucking over everyone in the world. No, that's ridiculous. They themselves are prioritizing their own needs above everyone else. Guess what? The players are prioritizing their needs over everyone else. I've seen players take ridiculous deals and do ridiculous shit to each other just because they would gain like an extra $1,000. Like ridiculous things that didn't even make sense going forwards down the road. But they prioritize themselves over everyone else. If everyone in this hierarchy is selfish, to the people on the bottom, it looks terrible because the ones on the top are being super selfish and we have no say in it. But if you yourself are selfish within your component, it's kind of an equivalent thing. Now, sure, it's on a different scale, so you can say which one's better or worse for the scene and all that, but it's still a selfish impulse that is creating what's happening here. So an issue I have a massive problem with these players is this unchecked assumption, this unjustified assumption that players, professional esports players, should have the right to choose what league they compete in. Now, Noah Winston, funnily enough, in the time while I was traveling for my holiday to Korea, when I was setting out all this stuff and starting to do my research on this topic and through the masses of stuff I had to wade through, what's funny is Noah Winston, in his reply to the player's letter, actually addressed some of this. I thought did a pretty decent job. Because basically, this is how I'd describe it. I think it is ridiculous that it is a presumed right of some kind that players should be able to choose where they compete. It's even being presented as a worker's right, even though I don't really understand that concept in itself. Because since when do employees within a company get to decide where the company does business, how they do business? They don't. They just work. They get the wage for their work. They get paid for the day's work. And that's about it. They don't get a lot of say. Now, they do if they've got unions, etc. Players don't. Therefore, that's a totally separate issue. They don't have unions. Therefore, they don't have that sort of leverage. They're just someone who comes along, does his job, gets paid for it. They can try and unionize, which they haven't really done quite yet. They're doing it to some small degree, but without an express union that has to be negotiated with, they don't get a say in that particular thing. They sign away all their rights and all this decision-making to the people above them to make those decisions. I mean, what I don't understand about this as a presumed right is people don't even address why it would be the case that players would have the right or why they should have the right to decide what league they compete in. They just consistently reaffirm it over and over again as if it was some fact, some axiom of physics or something, that this is the way the universe works, like gravity. No, it's ridiculous. So players receive salary and prize money. Now, that's what they get in exchange for being in these teams. They don't get power. They don't get a say in how things are done. Now, if that's in their contract, they do. It isn't in their contract. They know it's not in their contract, yet now they're complaining after they signed said contracts. Now, you would think, I understand now why players sign contracts for really high salaries and then don't get power. But you can't complain like this and then year after year keep signing the contracts. If you're a high-level player, if you're someone in a really big position of leverage, and you're choosing between a team that give you 11,000 or a team that could give you 9,000, and you say to that team that's only the 9,000, you know what, your offer's less, but if you give me a bit more bargaining power or you give me a bit more say in what happens and put it in my contract, I'll go with you for 9,000. No player's done that, by the way. I'm not aware of instances in CSGO where big teams have done things like that overall. And as a result, they've purposely chosen to go away from these options and not to make it a particular case. Now, sure, they're very young and a lot of them don't have proper agents and don't have proper representation that could allow them to negotiate such things, and they might get strong-armed. That's absolutely the case. But they haven't made any attempts to. They haven't got unions in place which could even help set the standards for these sorts of things. I mean, sure, you could certainly make the case in terms of why it's bad that the players can't choose which league to take place in, that the players, in theory, would choose the leagues that have the biggest prize money and offers. So you could make the case that, okay, even though it's in the contract, maybe it was in bad faith that when I signed that contract and when the org set these terms, they then might choose leagues in which there's less money or compete in fewer tournaments and therefore my earning potential is less, but the org can make more and it doesn't have to share that with me. That could maybe be made the case as to why even the currently signed contracts might not be fair in that particular sense. But my big problem with that is the root of that case is that they have to be able to force PEA and EPL to both take place and be in both of them. If that's not the case, then it was always going to be one or the other. It was going to be PEA or it's going to be EPL as it was anyway. And if PEA really is worth more to NA and to these teams and these players, they can't really make the bad faith argument in that particular one because the guy's not taking away your earning potential. What is he taking away? You have to outline these things as to why you want to be in EPL and why you should have this right, why it's very important in that particular sense. Don't just affirm it as, oh, well, the people at the bottom should have all the power. Why should they? I mean, people at the top should have all the power. If someone said that, we'd ask them, well, why should they? And we'd explain why they shouldn't. Well, why should the people at the bottom have all the power? Why should they even have equal power? What have they done to deserve equal power? These are all real questions you have to ask, and that must be answered before people can just assert things over and over again and be treated with respect as though what they're saying has any meaning. So consider this. This is one of the reasons why I don't think players should necessarily, or it isn't assumed without negotiating, that they should have the right to decide what league they compete in. The job of the organisation, the team they play for, is to be better at business and to understand the bigger picture and have that all planned. That's the job of the org. The job of the player is to play and to be operating in the small frame of his contract and trying to play as best as he can within the leagues he's in to get as much success, which the org will then translate, hopefully, and use as part of their advertising deck to get more sponsors and to get the whole thing bigger and then funnel money back down to the player, which is already in exchange for his salary and in the future maybe higher salaries. That's the job of the org. Most players don't even have equity in these teams. They have no part in the bigger picture of these teams. Only the smaller part of however long their contract lifespan is. So why would they get a say in something that might affect the bigger picture, long-term picture of that organisation who might not even have this player in a year? Why would he give up power in that particular sense? Even sports pros make the mistake of thinking that. Even though they have unions, they think, well, I've got a 2-year contract with them, and then their team might present like, oh, you're the face of the team, man, you're the franchise. But in the future, if that team chooses not to sign them, or they don't sign with that player, that team, then that's why the team can go any direction they want with which players they sign and which coach they sign, all the rest of it. Because ultimately, that player isn't directly tied to the long-term future. So sports pros sometimes they fall in the mistake themselves to think, well, they're going to have me for life here as the franchise player. You know what? Some Dwayne Wade type scenario comes along where they're like, oh yeah, we don't want to give you the max contract or whatever, you know. Oh, we're just going to let you go actually. Oh, you gave up a lot of things, you did a lot of things. Oh, thanks for that, but actually we're going to go a different route now. You know, it's not assumed. You can't fall into that trap. That's why whenever people stress, like orgs talk with teams talk with players, and people stress that it's all about the guy below them in the hierarchy. They do that to make the guy below them feel better, to make the public think that they're really focused on him. They're focused on themselves primarily. Hopefully they take him into account, but if he really buys into that, then he's the sucker. So if you're a player and you look around and you think, oh, well, seems like all these people are on my side, you're the sucker then. You're the one who believed that shit. It was always like this from day one. You just never got to a point where it really was a decision point and where you wanted to go one way and they wanted to go the other, and then you saw who was in control, who actually held the keys, who wielded the power in this scenario over themselves and you. You never saw that until now, and that's your own fault, and more fool you, mate. Then you've got to ask yourself, will teams in the future, as in teams of players, not orgs, will teams like the TSM players, will they in the future take less money or go to smaller organisations to get more say? I doubt it. I mean, history so far has not proven as much. They still would give up all these rights for the extra $1,000. Some of them still already have done as much as this and then now complain, oh, where are all my rights? You signed your rights away, mate. That's why they gave you as much. They wanted to do that so that, yes, in the future, you know what, they might make more money. They gave you that money now so that you'd sign with them, the best team, so that then when they make more money, they can give themselves more money. First of all, that's not ridiculous. The deal's already set out as it is. They haven't tricked you. It's not nothing false about the contract. You just didn't understand the way the contract works and you somehow assume that you were entitled to the majority share of the profits. Then why don't you negotiate as much? Oh, would no team give you it? Well, welcome to reality, mate. There's a lot of assumptions here from the fans and from players that are just ridiculous, very naive about business, and actually quite childish. And, oh, I should just have everything, even though I haven't got the skill to debate for it, to actually negotiate for it, and I'm not willing to even put my neck on the line to get it. Well, then why should you get it? How do you think those teams are getting the power through stuff like PEA? They're actually putting themselves out there, and they're willing to go to war here to try and get this stuff, knowing that in the future, if they get more power and more revenue share, it'll be better for them in the long run. That's what players, until this letter, were not willing to do. And actually, even with this letter, haven't necessarily shown they're willing to. They just publicly expressed their disappointment with it, and they so far haven't said anything unionized, thing, oh, we won't play for you then if you don't do this for us. So quite ridiculous all in all. By the way, in terms of other teams and other entities not involved in PEA, some of these people need to shut the fuck up. They don't really. When I say shut the fuck up, you can always talk. You'll just be treated like an idiot if you do. So if you want to seem smart, you need to shut the fuck up. Like, the idea that Taz from Virtus Pro is going off about this, he's just signed with a group of people who are some of the shadiest people to ever enter esports, with a bunch of things in the background of some of the companies above them in the hierarchy that are incredibly unethical and have so far shown massive potential abuses that might happen one day in the future within their org and the people that they're involved with and their links otherwise. So the idea that they're coming out is like, oh, we did this because they are great player advocates. Get the fuck out. That's not even vaguely plausible. You just haven't come to the point yet where your fucking owners ring the bell and you have to come and eat your dinner when they say so, mate. Like, that's absolutely ludicrous that someone like that's presenting themselves as some sort of a player advocate. Yeah, do something about it then. Use your leverage. Go on then, do something for them. You come along next time with WESA and all that stuff and get things how you want them. Let's see it happen. The idea that the Astralis people are coming out now, well, you remember, the report is they want to run their own leagues. Oh, I'm sure they will have an unbiased view about how leagues should be run and what they would do with their players. I just want to make this point, okay, because it's something in general that needs to be made a point of. Maybe I'll do a whole video on it one day. But Astralis, because they're the most famous example of a player-owned org, I think have actually massively misrepresented themselves to the public, or at the very least allowed the public to take a perception knowingly that is not the case, and then allow the fans to think that player-owned org means the players as a whole own the majority or controlling interest of the org, which as far as I can tell is not the case with Astralis, with Godsent, with Heroic. Rather, the players in some sense own the org, as in the player might own 1% of the org, and therefore doesn't control the whole org, doesn't have a say in everything that's done within the org. There are other people who are the investors who own the majority, who are the ones who propped up the whole thing. How do you think it was running? You think Device just took his prize money and started running the whole org? Get the fuck out. That's not even vaguely what's happening. That's why he's getting paid a mad salary. So the Astralis players own a percentage, so they might be better off. Like, say, funnily enough, by the way, like the PEA example is better than being in WESA in theory. They might be getting more money and the players might be getting a better deal. That's the case. But presenting it as some panacea, oh, we've solved it all, now our players get a say in everything. That's not necessarily the case. And if so, go ahead and outline it for us. If you're so transparent and you tell the truth, tell us what percent everyone owns in Astralis. Tell us how they vote, what actual say they have. Can they be outvoted by people above them? Who decides all the things that they go on? This would be really nice to know, right? If it's really the case, you've broken ground. Why not explain all this? Why not outline it all to us in the public? Now, players, this is a key point I want to make about why players do not automatically have the right to decide these things. Beyond, as I say, these decisions could have massive implications for an org and its future and its earning potential and even billions of dollars down the line that the player wouldn't even be involved in and shouldn't necessarily be involved in and has no right or say over. Here's another aspect. Players cannot do what organizations do, the essential things that they do, because to negotiate deals, to run other players, to manage things, to book flights, to arrange sponsor obligations, to discuss with leagues, to negotiate with leagues, to prep healthcare, whatever else, all these things, to make the contracts. All these things don't just take some time. A player couldn't do that and then do this on site. They take all your time. That's what all your bosses are doing at these orgs. That's what all these orgs are doing all the time. That's why there are so many people involved in esports hired outside of just players. It also requires expertise that players do not, by and large, have. I'd say pretty much no player in esports right now could come along and do a better job than Jack from Cloud9 and negotiating deals, running his org, etc. I'd say none could. And so far there's no evidence to suggest there is one. I'd also say players do not have the skill set. I mean, there's very little connection between the skills it takes to be a pro player and even a well-marketed one and someone who runs an org and knows how to do all these other things. I mean, it's not just about being able to negotiate a deal. Now, people might say, oh, but I'm sure if a team was made like Astralis, they made a player-owned org, I'm sure they could go and get really good sponsors. Yeah, maybe they could. Would they get the best value from those sponsors? Do they know enough about the industry to know not only what is every other team's deal with these sponsors, but what is my potential leverage power against these sponsors? Can I ask for twice as much? What is the sponsor able to pay? How can I negotiate him up? How can I get other factors for myself? They haven't spent their whole lives dedicated to the industry. They don't have a track record like these people who run the big orgs do. And they certainly have benefited from these massive orgs. And yet that's one of the ridiculous things about it. So let's talk about this for a second. Let's talk about the economics of teams to see how ridiculous this is. Because people keep saying, right, esports is nothing without the players. Well, what are the players without the teams? Why does no one stop and think about that? You can't just say that, there's all these brilliant and successful players and, we can't just replace them with anyone or assume that more will come along if we take them out of the equation. But then when you go up the level in the hierarchy to the orgs, the teams, just say, oh, well, actually, you know what? Yeah, we could totally replace all those brilliant and successful orgs. And if you took them out of the equation, you just made a whole load of new orgs, probably be just as good, if not better. You can't say that. That is absolutely ridiculous. One of the most ludicrous premises you could make right now. There's no basis for it whatsoever. I mean, there have been plenty of teams and organizations, in terms of team orgs, not tournament organisers, just to make the distinction, been plenty of them who were shit in terms of player treatment, in terms of business. These owners, the PEA ones, by and large, have built successful brands. They have forged reputations for being very good at what they do. They have got the business acumen and basis to be able to negotiate huge and ever increasing larger sponsorship deals. And now to even make demands of leagues, things that players could never have dreamed of doing. The main business, let's talk about the economics of these teams so you can understand why teams are so important, orgs are so important, and why players are not just, yes, they're the lifeblood, but they aren't the organs. That's the point. You understand that? The team is like the organ that takes in the lifeblood and does something with it. These players, yeah, you need the blood, but you need the fucking organs too. Catch that blood in a body and no organs. So the main business of most of these orgs, these successful ones, is getting exposure, because that allows them to have the basis. That's the currency that they essentially exchange with the sponsors to get the money. Now, yes, prize money is great, but that mainly goes to the players. That's a smaller cut of the pie. The bigger cut of the pie is the sponsorship money. So, and because they do such a good job, these orgs, they are entitled to the lion's share of that sponsorship money. So when you have this main business being exposure, sure, some of that comes from tournaments. Some of it comes from success in tournaments. Not that much overall. Sure, that's a lot of the exposure. But you know what? A lot of it comes from just metrics that you can take to the sponsor and show him this is what I'm giving you. That's why personal streaming outside of tournaments is so important to a lot of these teams. I mean, the funny thing is, Scoots himself being involved in Evil Geniuses should be able to he'll know this basis, which is, this is how Evil Geniuses built their business and became the biggest esports brand, at least in the Western world. I mean, people don't know about Korea and China, so I won't bring that into the equation right now. This is how they were able to make themselves the biggest. EG made it so that through all their sponsor obligations, including streaming, you didn't even have to win the tournament. And yet, as an EG player, you could get the maximum exposure and therefore have the best deal and the best salary in the Western esports industry. Even though someone else was better than you, someone was winning the tournaments, someone in theory was getting more tournament exposure, you could have a better deal, you could have better sponsors, you could have better exposure overall. That was the basis of how they reliably built their brand to be big, bigger, biggest. And until Alex Garfield left and the GGA thing and all the in League of Legends teams came up, they were number one and no one really was challenging them overall. So that's the basis. That's the lifeblood of a lot of these teams and how they want to build their model. So what you've got to say is, that actually has a logic to it. It's more stable than doing well in tournaments and trying to then parlay that into business success as being with number one or whatever. So what people need to understand is how important it is to these orgs to have that time to get that reliable streaming and exposure in, which they then can parlay into high salaries to give to the players, to non-endemic sponsors to get even more money through the door. Sure, playing in tournaments is good, but playing in tournaments, before these teams came along and before they started to make demands and teams tried to leverage against tournament organisers, before that, playing in tournaments wasn't going anywhere further than it is right now. Events were getting bigger and having more eyes on them, but where were the events that were providing revenue for teams and players? I mean, this is one of the reasons, one of the unspoken aspects of this whole PEA versus WESA thing, which is ECS versus EPL. Why are all the PEA teams on board with ECS but not EPL? Why are EPL, what is it that they benefit from with ECS? As far as I know, the teams get more directly from ECS and potentially some sort of equity or revenue sharing. Then you've got the whole WESA power play. Remember, the WESA power play was to get the teams that joined WESA to say, join with us, work with us, be under our operation, our association, and then you will get rev share in the future. This is why it's a benefit to you over just playing in the tournaments normally. WESA and ESL, before the PEA and people like that came along, were set to keep building the scene, and then one day there would be a Riot MLBAM type broadcast rights deal that WESA would make, and WESA and ESL and MTG and the teams within WESA to some degree would all take their cut of the pie and their money, and everyone else in their league and everyone in other leagues who weren't WESA would get diddly squat, would get none of that money. That's where it would stop. So people like PA, if you sat on the sideline watching you counting all your money, oh, I'm not in WESA. Yeah, I am. And not only that, WESA teams would be sat with a bit of, oh, I've got a bit of cash here. What's that? And then ESL and WESA and MTG would have a massive stack of the money. That's one of the aspects that people don't seem to understand about the importance of what these teams have done and how these teams are actually, yes, you can say it's misguided or you can disagree with how they do it. I don't know, I necessarily agree with it all, but the notion isn't a ridiculous one. The impulse is not a ridiculous one overall. Then you've got to consider that playing in all three leagues at the same time or concurrently or consecutively would absolutely wreck any chance to stream or do other sponsorship. It's already make it pretty hard at the moment, would make it even harder. So one of the problems right here is, sure, an unspoken aspect in terms of PEA, they haven't been able to address this because they can't, is that PEA came along at the worst time ever, because beforehand they had Cloud9, great, they were doing awesome. You know, Optic hadn't risen up yet, so who cares? SK, sure, they're not in PEA, but they're Brazilians anyway, not technically North American. Now, unfortunately, all the teams in PEA aren't amazing at Counter-Strike. Cloud9 obviously didn't even qualify for the recent major, and have dropped off massively since their Pro League win. And Optic's risen up to become the best NA team, and SK is the best team in the region anyway, even with the player swap. That's not great timing for them, because it highlights the lack of competition in a PEA league. I mean, PEA can't themselves, this is probably a problem that their players were worried about, they can't just go ahead and assume that this will work like the NALCS would work and has been very successful as its own individual league in League of Legends. I mean, like I say, it's just bad timing. Then you've got to consider maybe the viewership and therefore eventually the revenue sharing, depending on how successful the league is able to sell in the future, wouldn't be as good as they imagined. I mean, I have to say, it still sounds better, and it still sounds like a better chance to me than letting ESL get all the money and never getting a share of the broadcast rights in the future. That still sounds better, and I can see why the PEA teams, the orgs, would want to do that myself, because they're going to help. WESA is going to help ESL, MTG, and their own teams to a lesser degree. They're not going to help PEA teams. So PEA is there to help PEA and PEA's own teams. To me, I don't see why that's a ridiculous balance. People are making it one versus the other one. Both are trying to do the same thing and trying to benefit themselves. PEA going forwards, here's the problem. They've got the issue with the player voting. Now, either PEA man up and they just enforce their contract and say, you know what, we said all that, you do get a say, but you can only sort of make a plea to me, and I'm in charge of you, and I'll decide what's going to happen. You can lay the law down like that and say, fuck the PR problems, we'll go forward with this, and hopefully people eventually realise WESA isn't any better in this sense, in fact could be worse. Or they have to change the balance. They have to live up to what they're saying and give players a voice, and they actually have to acquiesce to the players somehow. Personally, I mean, I could see how that could be a mistake if they want full control, but they have to essentially give the players more. Their balance has to be changed in the voting board so that players can overrule things. It also seems at the moment like it's problematic keeping Jason Katz, because he's the person who, so far, every move he's done so far has either been misconstrued or miscommunicated. At the end of the day, if you're a commissioner, you've got to be able to communicate with people. You've got to sell people on your vision of what's going on. You've got to make people at least think you're fair, and at least think that you have their interests in mind. He hasn't done a very good job with that at the moment, so that doesn't spell things very well going forward if he's the commissioner still. Then you've got the issue where I personally don't think it's that big a problem if PEA comes along and displaces EPL or ECS. Now, yes, I do think as a purist it would be less competitive. I wouldn't like to see it. But in terms of the business aspect, and bearing in mind you're all about player rights, like guys, in terms of what it would do to player rights, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. In fact, I could see how it might actually be better, or it might help in terms of revenue sharing and player rights going forwards. Actually, I could see that being better than the current option of just competing in EPL. Now, sure, it certainly might be the case if the league fails, as I outlined, and doesn't do as well as they thought it would, that there might be less profit, it might be less stuff, but I don't necessarily know that there's an alternative in EPL at the moment that outweighs it and is much better. I like EPL in as much as, since I know there's going to be the global event, it's going to be more competition. In terms of EPL NA, I don't really care. Like, if it was PEA was EPL NA and we still had a global event, that's fine to me. I would actually probably prefer that. If we're in a world, though, except I guess I wouldn't, because there'd be no SK and Optic. I'd rather have a league, obviously, that had those two. But that's obviously the plan anyway. If PEA was going to exist instead of EPL NA, I assume, as you saw in the outline from Noah Winston, where they had the amount you made, but then the amount you made if you're in PEA, that they would just get SK and Optic and bring them into the PEA league, but not PEA itself. They would compete there. It'd be the same as I would in EPL NA, but with more prize money. And then the teams would go to the global final. We'd get the global final anyway. There wouldn't be less competition. And in fact, it wouldn't solve the oversaturation issue, but it wouldn't make it any worse either. So that's not an issue to me. The problem is there has been so much negative attention to the sponsors of these teams, the teams themselves, and now the league of PEA, that who knows what this means for the future of PEA. I mean, if they're really going to give the choice to the players, and the players for some reason choose not to compete in PEA at all and compete in EPL, then has it just killed PEA for CSGO outright? So much negative attention. I mean, Reggie himself said in his comment to Shazam that PEA might be going away anyway, or some words to that effect. This is an issue because actually PEA had a lot of benefits for player rights, for players getting some money in the future, actually making some of the revenue, and for teams making a lot more of the revenue sharing than people in WESA, etc., were going to make if that one day is the big league. Because remember, there can't be a PEA and DPL in terms of in the future as to who you sell the broadcast rights to. So in terms of that, I think that is actually problematic because some really good businessmen from NA were trying to do something for themselves. Now, yes, they took priority. They were going to get most of the share. They would have the control. That's the way everyone is within this scenario. I mean, that's just the way it always is. What's that great Camus quote? Something like, every slave starts wanting justice and ends wanting a crown. That's what happens. You start out, oh, I'm just fighting for my corner. Oh, am I in a position of power now? I'm the king now. You're the slave. That's what everyone does in this scenario. So I think it's ridiculous how people have almost painted this whole thing in like moral or ethical terms. There's not a lot of that going on. It's about business, it's about the industry, and it's most importantly about who has the leverage. It's not about what they said. It's about, with actions, who can force something to happen, who can compel someone else at force to do what they want, and therefore who controls the scene. Not who says they do, who wants to say, who wants someone to listen to them. These are separate issues. It's about who actually has the control in that sense. And right now it is the PEA over their players, despite what's happened in terms of this PR nightmare. That's the only aspect there. Did the players win out in that sense by pressuring sponsors to make the teams say, okay, we'll give you what you want for now. Just stop. Everyone just stop banging on our sponsors. Like, we'll go back to how it was. Maybe that's where the power play happened. So we have to see how this unfolds in the next one. I'll do another part, at least one more part. I mean, obviously more could happen. That will be about the Gares Reginald issue.